ASAP's professional guidance resources are a suite of 5 resources that were created by and for ASAP members. And they include our Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Statement, our Code of Conduct and Professional Ethics, our Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Change Adaptation, our Knowledge and Competencies Framework for Climate Change Adaptation and Climate Resilience professionals, and a glossary that kind of ties everything together. All of these resources, as I mentioned, were created by and for ASAP members. And this slide shares the values inherent in the processes that we use to create and update these resources. So all of these resources are created by cross-sector groups collaborating together, representing multiple interests and perspectives. They're developed through consensus-based and or democratic processes where folks with different backgrounds are meeting as equals to produce a product together, really valuing getting input from all voices and ensuring that the process is accessible to folks from all backgrounds and interests. And finally, the processes that were used to develop these resources are steeped in our network values that I shared previously. So things like cultivating cultures of trust and trust building, and by taking a values-based perspective, we're able to kind of break down some of the traditional constraints that organizations face and to really produce products that address complex issues in a coherent and concise way. One of the key things that these resources do is really bridge the language gap between many actors in the adaptation and resilience space. So for example, banks and financial industries may talk about adaptation and resilience as risk and materiality. Municipalities and public entities may talk about it as vulnerability and resilience. Engineers and designers may talk about designs and standards. Ecosystem managers might talk about restoration and conservation. And businesses and community-based organizations might businesses in the community might talk about assets and continuity. These are all different languages used to articulate their goals and needs, and it can lead to barriers for working and learning across sectors and contexts. So articulating values and principles and outcomes and strategies and actions in a way that resonates across the languages that are used in these various contexts can bridge that gap and really help disparate actors come together to learn and work together. So that's really what we're going for with these professional guidance resources. So let's dive in. So first we have the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Statement. And I really actually invite you to just read this full statement. Read this and kind of sit with it. And when you're ready, I'd invite you to type in the chat just one thing that resonates for you from this statement. And thanks to Kyla breaking the ice here with histories of colonialism. Vanessa with communities are capable. Zoe with those who are least responsible are often the most impacted. Definitely keep your reflections coming. We're gonna move on, but you can refer back to the JEDI statement via the link that Kyla sent in the chat. So next we have our Code of Conduct and Professional Ethics, which includes values and beliefs, as well as principles and guidelines. And by articulating values and beliefs in our Code of Conduct and Professional Ethics, we're saying that knowledge alone is not enough for ethical action. Knowledge is not morally neutral, and it often demands that we take action. Also, in many instances, we need to take action even when we don't have all of the information we would ideally like to have. And then in other instances, information or knowledge that results from specific calculations may say that implementing a specific action isn't efficient or cost beneficial, but our values about human rights or the rights of nature dictate that we take that action anyway. And then we have principles and guidelines, and these articulate how ASAP members are expected to act as professionals in the field. And they fall into the categories that you can see here on the slide, things like performing quality work, centering justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, operating with integrity, and serving the needs of employers and clients. And we're going to move on here, but you can also access the Code of Ethics via the link to the resource suite that Kyla sent. I just want to pause briefly to spotlight an application of the Code of Ethics, which was by organizational member Neemac Fernleaf, who used the ASAP Code of Ethics to identify partners and articulate what their values are to their potential and current partners. Next, we have the Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Change Adaptation. And this is going to be the focus of the content of most of the rest of our training. So the Living Guide, takes and assumes the values and beliefs of the Code of Ethics, and it expands on the principles and guidelines that are in the Code of Ethics to articulate existing and aspirational principles of effective adaptation practice. And while the Code of Ethics is pretty set, we have updated it once since its creation, but for the most part, it's a static document. The Living Guide, as the name implies, is updated regularly to reflect changes in both existing and aspirational practice. The concepts are purposefully broad, so they can apply in many different contexts where adaptation is happening. And they're meant to both describe how adaptation is currently practiced, as well as articulate a vision for how it could be practiced to be the most equitable, ethical, and effective. So there are 4 sections in the Living Guide. We've got desired outcomes, principles, strategies and approaches, and categories of action. And by articulating exactly what we're trying to achieve as adaptation professionals to enhance adaptive capacity and reduce exposure and sensitivity, that we are saying that it's really important to have those as shared desired outcomes, and to say that first and foremost as we approach our work. And the Living Guide also asserts that we want to seek to achieve these outcomes first and foremost for those who are at the forefront of adaptation or on the front lines of climate change. And this is ASAP's definition of who that is. And at the core of how we operate is keeping people and communities who are at the forefront of climate change central to our work. But we know that the traditional adaptation field is largely white. It stems from the perspective of Western science. It can be difficult to recognize the importance of lived experience and acknowledging that a lot of work that's happening on the ground in communities that are most affected, is adaptation, even though it's not always being called that. So the principles section in the Living Guide articulates the principles for doing adaptation work well in a quality manner, hence the title of our training today. Some principles apply more strongly in certain areas of work. You can certainly expect to experience some tension between principles. And as we're going to do today, it's really important to cultivate relationships and identify tools to remain aware of how you're prioritizing the application of some principles over others and seek to find balance to best contribute to the desired outcomes that we just looked at. We hope and expect that anyone who really is already identifying as an adaptation professional will recognize all of these principles in their own work or will come to recognize them over time. And there are many different ways to apply each of these principles, and we expect that effective, ethical, and equitable adaptation will require use of many of these principles at once. So let's just take a few more seconds on this slide. Our second small group session is going to be focusing on the principles. You're going to be really deeply diving into that. So just in case you haven't had a chance to review them before you came here, take a look and scan the list and type in the chat which of these principles resonates really well with you. And that can be because it's really important to you, or it can be because you feel like you need to work on applying this principle in your work, but which principle is resonating well with you right now? Thanks, Stephen. Ensuring fairness and decision-making, addressing root causes, think in systems. Awesome. All right, so the Living Guide also contains strategies and approaches, and it's important to note that the context will really dictate which strategies and approaches are most applicable and how they should be used. And these strategies and approaches may align with the strategies and approaches adopted by a particular organization or sector or location, but we don't really expect them to be identical. They're meant to be more categorical. And then finally, the Living Guide has categories of action. And we, have designed these to encompass most types of adaptation work. We're certainly not going to say that. I'm sure someone could come up with something that's not included under one of these categories. But, this section provides some examples about how the principles and the strategies and approaches described in the other sections of the guide can be put into action. And it's important to note that this is not meant to be an adaptation planning or implementation process, and we don't expect that someone would be working necessarily on more than one type of action, but they certainly could be working on more than one type of action. So that's the Living Guide, and I just want to share briefly a spotlight on how the Living Guide has been applied by an ASAP member. So this comes from ASAP Board President Emily Wassley, and she used the Living Guide to develop her own kind of representation of her personal core adaptation and resilience principles to keep them front of mind in her daily work. So really briefly, I'm going to go through our final professional guidance resource, which is the Knowledge and Competencies Framework. And we're not going to dive into this in depth, but the Knowledge and Competencies Framework provides a complete view of the knowledge and competencies needed to ensure that professionals and students and learners of all type are prepared to do effective adaptation work in whatever context they may be operating in. And the idea here is that all adaptation professionals should possess each of these knowledge areas, and then the competencies, which I'll show in just a second. And here are the competencies. And I just invite you to scan this list really briefly, and if you feel so inclined, to share with us what's a competency in which you feel strong, and maybe a competency in which you feel like you need some more support. And here's an application spotlight for the Knowledge and Competencies Framework as well. And you'll get these slides after the presentation, so you can review that at your leisure. So those are the ASAP professional guidance resources. We also have the glossary, which I mentioned, and you can access everything at the link